At what point does the brand step in and go, right, we're opening a lawsuit against you because of you've said that this brand fits this car and we're pricing it differently? Like, at what point does that happen? We don't know. We know
It was just a late-night drive in Miami. But when Alex Gonzalez's ultra-rare $6 million Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport hit that curb, it did more than just shatter carbon fiber. It dragged YouTuber Mat Armstrong into a direct standoff with one of the most powerful brands on the planet. Bugatti actually locked the VIN, effectively switching the car off from afar and blocking every single part. Think about that for a second. If your dream car's manufacturer suddenly declared it unfixable and cut you off, would you walk away or fight back? The night the Chiron died, Mat chose to fight, risking his entire reputation and fortune on a rebuild that Bugatti said was impossible. It is clear that this wasn't just about a car anymore, but about who really owns what they buy. And as it turns out, the fallout from that Miami crash changed Mat's life forever. When a car costs $6 million, the rules of physics and finance start to feel a little different. For most of us, a fender bender is a headache. But for Alex Gonzalez, a young entrepreneur and trader known online as FX Alex G, a single night in Miami turned a mechanical masterpiece into a very expensive pile of carbon fiber junk. He had just bought a purple Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, which is a car so rare that only 60 of them exist in the entire world. It wasn't just any Chiron. The Pur Sport is the sharpened, track-focused version with that massive fixed rear wing and shorter gear ratios designed to tear up corners. According to the automotive reports from Motorius, Alex had barely owned the car for a few weeks before everything went south. One minute, he was living the ultimate automotive dream, and the next, he was staring at a wreck that would make even a billionaire's eyes water. The crash happened on a Miami highway, and from the way the footage looks, it was one of those split-second moments where everything just goes wrong. Alex was merging. There was a collision with a Suzuki, and suddenly, that beautiful purple front end was meeting a concrete barrier. When the dust settled, the airbags had deployed, the headlights were gone, and the suspension was twisted into shapes it was never meant to take. It is absolutely wild to think about how quickly a top-tier asset can flip into a massive liability. In less than a month, Alex went from driving the pinnacle of French engineering to sitting on a shell that Bugatti didn't even want to acknowledge anymore. When the official Bugatti technicians showed up to survey the damage, they didn't offer a repair plan. They essentially performed an autopsy and called it a total loss. Now, this is where the story usually ends for most people. The insurance company pays out, the car goes to a scrapyard, and everyone moves on. But the numbers here were so staggering that they defy logic. Because the Pur Sport is so rare, the insurance payout was massive. Yet the car ended up on Copart, which is essentially the world's most famous auction site for wrecked vehicles. According to the breakdown provided by Supercar Blondie's investigative team, the car was listed with a staggering estimated retail value that seemed laughable given the state of the front bumper. Alex actually decided to buy back his own wreck from the insurance company, spending somewhere between $1.6 and $1.9 million just to get the keys back to a car that hadn't even been driven. That is a life-changing amount of money for a vehicle that the manufacturer had already written off as dead. Now, if you know Mat, you know he has this almost pathological need to fix things that everyone else says are unfixable. He's built his entire career on taking crashed supercars and bringing them back to life in his garage in the UK. But a Bugatti is a completely different beast. When Mat flew out to Miami to see the car for the first time, he wasn't just looking at a dented hood. He was looking at a car where a single headlight costs more than a brand new Porsche. He saw the devastation in person, the cracked carbon tub, and the sheer complexity of a W16 engine that requires a specialized team just to service. On paper, this project was an impossible mission. It was a financial prison waiting to happen. Yet for Mat, it was the biggest content opportunity he had ever seen. He saw a chance to do what no independent builder had ever done: rebuild a Chiron Pur Sport without the help of the factory. Imagine you are standing in a garage in Florida, looking at a $2 million pile of scrap metal. The brand that built it tells you it's impossible to fix. The parts you need don't technically exist for sale to the public. Every person with a sane financial mind is telling you to run away as fast as you can. Would you actually double down and buy back that dream car if the numbers made even a tiny bit of sense on paper? Or would you cut your losses and move on? It's easy to say we'd fight from the comfort of a couch, but when it's your millions on the line and the manufacturer has already turned its back on you, that decision becomes a lot heavier. Most people think hypercar ownership is all glamour and high-speed runs, but one bad night left Alex with a problem that nobody wanted to underwrite and a bill that would bankrupt almost anyone else. Matt and Alex eventually reached an agreement to attempt the impossible. The plan was relatively simple in their heads. Matt would lead the rebuild, they'd strip the car down to the bare bones, identify what was actually broken, and start sourcing parts from wherever they could find them. They were looking at a mountain of work, but the excitement was infectious. They were going to show the world that these cars aren't just precious museum pieces that have to be sent back to Molsheim every time they get a scratch. They wanted to prove that with enough grit and mechanical knowledge, you could beat the system. It felt like the ultimate David versus Goliath story, with a British guy in a hoodie taking on a multi-billion euro French titan. But wait, because this is where it gets incredibly weird. Just as they were getting started, literally as they were preparing to ship the car and start ordering components, the Goliath in this story decided to fight back. Bugatti wasn't just watching from the sidelines, they were monitoring the situation very closely. And while Matt was busy filming the first few steps of the teardown, Bugatti quietly flipped a digital switch in the background. We were about to find out that when you buy a Bugatti, you don't just own a car. Bugatti's invisible kill switch. Mat Armstrong touched down in Miami in October 2025, walking into that humid Florida garage, ready for what he thought was just his biggest mechanical challenge yet. He spent hours crawling over the car, and surprisingly, the news wasn't all bad. While the front end looked like it had been through an industrial shredder, that massive 8-liter W16 engine and the gearbox actually seemed fine. The radiators were toast, the mounting brackets were snapped, and the structural carbon fiber was bruised. But the heart of the machine was beating. But then, on October 20th, the entire project hit a brick wall that had nothing to do with wrenches or welding. Bugatti officially marked the VIN as a total loss in their global database. This wasn't just a status update, it was a digital execution. It meant that every single Bugatti dealer and authorized workshop on the planet was instantly blocked from selling so much as a washer or a bolt to anyone associated with that car. Think about that for a second. You spend millions on a vehicle, you own the title, and you have the keys, but the manufacturer decides from an office in France that your car is no longer allowed to exist. Here is where it gets incredibly tense. Alex Gonzalez, who isn't exactly the type to sit quietly, decided to take the fight public. He posted a 24-hour ultimatum on social media, essentially telling Bugatti that they had one day to agree to sell them parts, or he and Matt would start 3D printing and fabricating their own components. It was a massive gamble, but it worked, at least for a moment. The sheer amount of social pressure actually dragged the CEO of Bugatti, Mate Rimac, directly into the conversation. According to the breakdown on the Motorious Automotive site, there were frantic DMs and even direct phone calls between the CEO and the owners of the car. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because Rimac initially seemed like he might play ball. He's an innovator himself, a guy who started by building electric cars in his garage, so there was a flicker of hope that he'd appreciate the hustle. But after that initial conversation, the corporate machine kicked back in. Rimac eventually doubled down on the lockout, framing the whole thing as a safety and liability issue. He argued that a 300-mile-an-hour hypercar isn't something you can just patch up in a shed. And if that car ever crashed again, the blood would be on Bugatti's hands. It sounds reasonable on the surface, but it highlights an uncomfortable truth. When you buy a hypercar, you don't really own your fate with that machine. one database update turned a fixable car into a global pariah. I'm curious where you all stand on this, because it's the ultimate right-to-repair debate. Do you side with Bugatti's safety-first stance, believing these cars are too dangerous for anyone but the factory to touch? Or do you stand with Matt and Alex? If you worked for years to finally afford your dream car, only to have the manufacturer switch it off because of a repairable accident, would you accept that? Or would you feel like your property rights were being trampled? It's a fine line between a brand protecting its reputation and a brand protecting a total monopoly on its products. And in this case, Bugatti was choosing the monopoly. They weren't just refusing a warranty, they were trying to make sure the car stayed dead, so it wouldn't tarnish the fleet. But they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. Mat Armstrong doesn't do staying dead. Instead of being intimidated by a billion-euro brand and a global parts embargo, Matt decided that if he couldn't get the parts, he'd just have to see exactly how the car was built so he could find another way. He didn't just start replacing panels, he decided to take the Chiron apart more aggressively than almost any factory technician would ever dare. If Bugatti wanted to treat him like an outsider, he was going to act like one. And that meant doing the unthinkable. Let's check it out. Splitting the unsplittable. Bugatti spent years convincing the world that its cars are less like machines and more like sacred relics that can only be touched by high priests in white lab coats. They've built this massive aura of impossible complexity around the Chiron, telling owners that if anything major happens, the car has to be shipped back to Molsheim or one of a tiny handful of elite service centers. But in February 2026, Mat Armstrong decided to test whether that was actually true or just really effective marketing. He stood in a relatively normal workshop and prepared to do the unthinkable. He was going to split a $6 million Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport in half. This is the kind of job that is supposed to require specialized factory jigs, laser alignment tools, and a direct line to French engineers. But Matt was doing it with a makeshift jig, and at one point, literally supporting the rear of the car on a workshop bin. Now here's where it gets interesting. To get to the real damage, you have to separate the carbon fiber monocoque, the tub where the driver sits, from the massive rear subframe that holds that quad-turbo W16 engine. It sounds terrifying, and honestly, watching them back out those massive titanium bolts was enough to make anyone's stomach churn. But as they physically pulled the two halves apart, the myth of the Bugatti started to crack. It turns out that beneath the layers of prestige and million-dollar branding, the Chiron is surprisingly modular. A lot of the components that people assume are fused are actually just bolted on. Matt realized that once you get past the initial shock of the price tag, you're looking at a car that was actually designed to be assembled and disassembled in sections. But wait, because the split also revealed exactly why Bugatti wanted this car to stay dead. Once the two halves were separated, the true extent of that Miami highway impact became visible. They found a cracked gearbox housing area, which is a nightmare scenario for any car, let alone a Bugatti. There was a damaged engine mount that was literally sheared, crushed coolant lines that looked like they'd been through a vise, and an exhaust system that was bent into a shape no engineer ever intended. This was the hidden damage that the insurance adjusters saw when they initially totaled the car. According to technical details shared on the Influor's automotive platform, these specific failures were exactly what gave Bugatti the legal and safety justification to call the car a total loss. From their perspective, the structural integrity of the powertrain was compromised, and that's a massive liability for a car that can do 260 miles per hour. Here is the thing, though. Seeing that damage didn't make Matt want to quit. It actually made him more confident. Why? Because seeing it up close proved that these weren't magical, mystical failures. They were mechanical ones. A broken bracket is still just a broken bracket, even if it's on a Bugatti. Matt's realization here is something the hypercar industry really doesn't want you to think about. If a guy with the right skills and a YouTube audience can safely access the core of the car and identify the fixable points, it undermines the entire narrative that only the factory can be trusted. It makes you wonder how much of that "send it back to us" policy is actually about safety, and how much of it is about protecting a very lucrative revenue stream. If independent high-end shops could fix these cars, Bugatti would lose its total monopoly on the life cycle of its vehicles. And that brings us to a pretty big question. If you saw a project like this documented from start to finish, every bolt tightened and every repair tested on camera, would you actually trust that car at high speeds? Or is there a part of you that thinks some jobs, especially when you're talking about the structural bond between a W16 engine and a carbon tub, really should stay factory only, no matter how talented the builder is? It's one thing to fix a crashed BMW, but when the margin for error is measured in lives at triple-digit speeds, the right to repair starts to feel a lot more complicated. The same brands that sell you on exclusivity and one-of-a-kind engineering are also quietly designing their cars in modules and bolt-on sections. They do it because it makes the initial assembly faster and more efficient, but they don't want the public to know how fixable those sections actually are. Mat was effectively pulling back the curtain on a billion-dollar secret, but even with the car split and the modularity exposed, he was still facing one massive, terrifying hurdle. Among all the crushed lines and bent metal, they found one specific broken bracket. It's the one that literally holds the engine and gearbox together, the primary connection point for the entire powertrain. This wasn't a part he could just order from a catalog, and if he couldn't recreate it or repair it to factory strength, this whole miracle rebuild was about to become a very expensive, very dangerous death trap. The weld that shouldn't have worked. Everything in this rebuild, every late night, every dollar spent, and every argument with Bugatti eventually boiled down to one single piece of metal. It's this specific gearbox mount bracket that literally holds the relationship between the engine and the gearbox together. If you're Bugatti, you don't fix parts like this. You throw away the entire casting and replace it with a brand new, factory-fresh unit. But remember, Mat Armstrong is locked out of the catalog. He can't just call up a dealer and order a new one, so he had to make a choice that most hypercar owners wouldn't even dream of. He had to decide whether to 3D scan and CNC machine a completely new piece from scratch, or do something even more controversial: repair the original. This is where the story gets really human, because Mat didn't go to a high-tech corporate lab. He went to Bob, an independent machinist and welder at the machine shop, who has the kind of hands-on experience that you just can't buy with a marketing budget. Now here's where it gets interesting. Bob didn't just fire up a welder and start sparking away. He had to study the metal, check the specific alloy specifications, and confirm that the casting could actually handle the heat and the structural load of 1,500 horsepower. According to technical deep dives from influencers, this was the absolute make-or-break moment. Bob didn't just fix the crack. He slowly rebuilt the area, reinforcing it with extra material and adding structural ribs that might actually make this welded part stronger than the original factory casting. It's wild to think that the safety of a $6 million car was resting entirely on the steady hand of a guy in a quiet workshop. But that's exactly where the magic of this rebuild lived. But wait, because while Bob was handling the heavy metal, Mat was busy dismantling the myth of Bugatti's secrecy in other ways. He started using 3D scanning and CAD modeling to recreate body panels that the factory refused to sell him. He even started designing a custom Valvetronic exhaust system to replace the destroyed factory parts. And as he dug deeper into the car's electronics, he found something that Bugatti definitely doesn't advertise in its brochures. A lot of the sensors and smaller components that were supposedly unobtainable looked suspiciously like parts used by the Audi and Volkswagen Group. It hints at a reality that the hypercar world tries to hide. Even the most exclusive cars on Earth have cousins that are much, much cheaper. Mat wasn't just fixing a car, he was reverse engineering a billion-euro business model. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If you were in Mat's shoes, would you actually trust a welded and reinforced original part over a brand new factory casting? It's a massive responsibility to take on. Most big corporations avoid that kind of risk at all costs, which is exactly why they just tell you to buy a new one. But Bob and Matt weren't looking for a corporate solution. They were looking for a mechanical one. This raises a bigger question about the future of car ownership. How much of a hypercar's price is actually engineering? And how much of it is just secrecy and gatekeeping? If a small independent shop can model, reinforce, and test these components outside the official system, then the manufacturer's control over the life and death of their cars starts to look a lot more like a monopoly and a lot less like a safety requirement. Think about that choice for a second. Would you ever let an independent machinist take that kind of responsibility on your own vehicle, especially one that can hit triple-digit speeds in a heartbeat? It's the ultimate test of trust in human skill versus a corporate badge. Matt and his network of specialists were quietly proving that no official parts didn't have to mean no safe fix. They were recreating everything an OEM does: diagnosing, modeling, reinforcing, and testing. But they were doing it on their own terms. It was a complete rejection of the idea that you need a permission slip from France to maintain the property you already paid for. But here's the thing: you can have the best welds in the world and the most accurate 3D scans, but none of it matters if the car won't actually wake up. After months of grinding, welding, and searching for workarounds, the team finally reached the point where they had to put the two halves of the car back together. They had the repaired mount, the custom exhaust, and a mountain of hope, but they still had no idea if the car's computers would even allow the engine to fire. Everyone was about to find out whether Matt had achieved a miracle or if Bugatti was about to be proven right in the most devastating way possible. The tension in that shop was thick enough to cut as they prepared for the very first start. Running again, but at what cost? March 2026. After months of being told his project was a safety hazard and a physical impossibility, Mat Armstrong stood in his shop with every camera rolling and his hand on the ignition of the Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport. They had checked the fluids, reconnected the sprawling web of electronics, and prayed that Bob's reinforced mount would hold the sheer torque of that W16. When the engine finally fired, it didn't just sputter to life. It settled into a perfectly clean idle that echoed through the workshop. Seeing that purple beast move under its own power with absolutely no immediate error codes was a massive, undeniable victory. It was a direct contradiction to the official narrative that an independent builder couldn't safely bring a dead Bugatti back to life. But even as the car began to drive, the internet started doing what it does best: finding reasons to doubt. Rumors began circulating about a supposed hairline crack in the gearbox that Matt was allegedly ignoring. According to coverage from Supercar Blondie, these claims got so loud that Matt eventually had to step in and clarify the technical reality. He showed that the crack wasn't in the gearbox housing itself, which would have been catastrophic, but in a secondary mounting point that they had already structurally repaired and reinforced beyond factory specs. It's interesting how even after you've physically beaten a billion-euro brand, the ghost of their safety-first PR continues to haunt the project. Now, here's the reality of what happened to Matt after the cameras stopped rolling on that first drive. While the car runs and drives, there is no clean happily ever after when you're dealing with a salvage title on a 1 of 60 hypercar. The resale value of this car is now a complete mystery. Even though it's arguably the most famous Bugatti on the planet right now, traditional collectors and insurance companies often won't touch a rebuilt hypercar. Matt essentially traded a predictable financial path for a permanent spot on the manufacturer's naughty list. And that tension with Bugatti hasn't just gone away. It changed his entire business model and forced him to accept a level of risk that would keep most creators up at night. And get this, Matt hasn't slowed down or tried to play it safe since the Chiron. In April 2026, he revealed his next massive gamble, a repossessed Bugatti Veyron. According to his own project updates, he's falling right back into the same pattern of ignoring astronomical OEM repair quotes in favor of his own technical ingenuity. This particular Veyron arrived with a laundry list of faults. multiple cylinder misfires, a leaking front radiator, and a gearbox stuck in park that Bugatti had quoted nearly $350,000 to replace. But in a move that felt like a direct jab at the hypercar establishment, Mat managed to engage the gears by replacing a simple fuse he bought from a local Halfords. This has sparked a lot of conversation among automotive commentators about whether this string of high-stakes builds will eventually backfire. He's locked himself onto a content treadmill where every project has to be more expensive and more controversial than the last just to keep the audience's attention. There's a documented pattern here. He's shifting from being a rebuild guy to being a disruptor guy. By taking on a Veyron immediately after the Chiron, he's signaling that the right to repair isn't just a one-off stunt for him, it's the core of his brand now. Think about the sheer scale of the gamble he's taking. According to industry analysis, Mat is operating on a razor-thin margin, where one catastrophic mechanical failure or one major lawsuit could potentially wipe out the progress of the last 5 years. He's moving away from the safety of Audi and BMW and entering a space where the parts don't exist and the manufacturers are actively hostile. It's a high-octane business model that relies on him being right 100% of the time. If Bob's weld on the Chiron mount fails at 200 miles per hour, or if the Veyron's easy fuse fix turns out to be masking a deeper electrical fire risk, the fallout wouldn't just be financial, it would be the end of his reputation. When you look at the full picture, the millions on the line and the constant legal pressure, it's clear Mat didn't just fix a car. He shifted the way millions of people look at manufacturer control. He proved that even the most exclusive total loss in the world can be saved if you're willing to take the responsibility that big corporations avoid. The real legacy of this purple Chiron isn't just that it's back on the road, but the precedent it sets for every other creator out there. Because of what Mat did, the next time a manufacturer tries to use a VIN lock to declare a car dead, the world is going to be a lot less willing to take their word for it. Looking at the stress and the risk Mat carries now, do you think you'd actually want his life? Or is the pressure of topping a Bugatti build something you'd rather watch from a distance? Mat proved the impossible by getting that unfixable Chiron running, but he also walked straight into a life of high-stakes gambling and corporate tension. The most shocking part is how a simple Halfords fuse eventually challenged a billion-dollar brand's monopoly. So, do you side with Mat's grit or Bugatti's safety stance? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.